Hi, we move on to looking at the message to the ekklesia in Sardis, the fifth of the seven messages that John is called to write from the risen Jesus to these communities. And as you can see on the chart on the right side, Sardis, the fifth of the seven, is parallel chiastically to Pergamum. Chiastically meaning that the structure of these seven messages is an A, B, C, D, C prime, B prime, A prime relationship. So Thyatira was at the center, and now we come down to Sardis on the other side. And the contrast could not be more clear. Thyatira, which was the least important city from a Roman perspective, was given enormous power and authority by the risen Christ, including power over the nations to rule with an iron rod, a power otherwise reserved in Revelation for the risen Christ himself. But here in Sardis, we will see a powerful Roman city that is told that it's nearly dead and needs to wake up if it doesn't want to be destroyed completely. So let's take a quick look at it on Google Maps, and then we'll explore some of the aspects of first century Sardis. So here's Patmos, where John was, and there you can see in the red marker where Sardis was. And we'll look up close at some of these things, but the Google Map thing allows us to see the gymnasium complex, which was built in the 2nd century and then onward, a huge gymnasium bath complex, and the Jewish synagogue was connected to it, as well as a temple to Artemis here outside the city and a temple to Athena. And there were others as well. As we go, we'll see some more of those. So let's look back at aspects of Sardis at this time. So it was the regional capital of the province of Lydia within the larger, the region of Lydia within the larger province of Asia Minor, and it had been founded many centuries before. Its mountaintop Acropolis, which you can see a picture of right here, was famous for being impregnable. But it was twice subject to surprise attacks by the Persian Cyrus and by Alexander the Great, and we'll see how that echoes into the threat of a thief coming and destroying in an hour, perhaps evoking cultural memory of those experiences within the people of Sardis. It was refounded by the Seleucid Greeks, their successors Alexander, after Persian destruction. And by the time of Revelation in the 1st century, it was the center of the imperial cult in the region of Lydia, and a rival of Smyrna and Ephesus, including the fact that its temple to Artemis was a rival to the Artemisian in Ephesus, as we saw in the first of the messages. Its wealth was legendary, and it came from the river Pactolus, and here's a little picture of some of the gold in the river. It goes back to King Croesus, a famous king who washed in the river of Pactolus there, and it's connected with the Midas legends as well. That gold, of course, made it very wealthy, and it's at least legendarily understood that the first coins were minted in Sardis back in the pre-Persian days. Much of the city was destroyed in a major earthquake in 17 of the Common Era, so really during Jesus' lifetime. And it affected many of the cities that John is writing to, but mostly Sardis. But it was rebuilt with imperial aid, leading to many major monumental structures and repairs. So the temple to Cybele, of which there's really no archaeological remains left, the stones were reused for other things. But it's the most ancient, and it's referred to in Greek writings, Cybele being the earth mother goddess and very important throughout the Roman world. Also, the Artemisian, as mentioned, originally built in the Seleucid period, but rebuilt here. And then this incredible bath gymnasium complex, which you can see here, the remains are substantial. And also, surprisingly, the Jewish synagogue is built right into the bath gymnasium complex, highlighting the prestige of the Jewish community in this city. And nothing about being a synagogue of Satan or other questions about hiding behind Jewish identity or some other form of that is mentioned in this message, and yet the Jewish community was very well established. Population was estimated at between 60 and 100,000, so substantial sized city, and it was the focus of the wool and clothing and carpet industries. When we'll see how that plays out in the question of the putting on fresh clothing. So let's begin to look at the message itself. So to the angel of the church in Sardis write, these are the words of the one who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. And we've seen that all the, as you can see from the summary here, all the titles of Jesus are echoing from pretty much from the first chapter here. So I know your works, you have a name of being alive, but are dead. And dead, we can see nekros is used a number of times throughout Revelation as an expression of not having faith, obviously not about being literally dead. And so the call is to wake up. And in our cultural context today, being woke can be used as a weapon from the right to suggest that people who claim themselves as woke are claiming some kind of arrogant superiority. But of course, it arose from the cry of the oppressed, especially black people, to wake up to the reality of systemic racism. And it's not a new metaphor. It goes back to ancient times. So we see it here, and it's used a number of times in the Bible, that sense of being asleep or dead, and then to wake up. And it's repeated, you see, in verse 3. It was a threat if you don't wake up. So wake up and strengthen, and the word sterazon for strengthen is only here in Revelation, what remains. And this is important because what's translated as what remains, aloipa, is the same as the remnant, as we saw in 224 in the last message. So that sense of a remnant theology. So although the absolute is stated in verse 1, you are dead, we'll see a couple of times here that there are references to not quite all dead. We see it in verse 2, and then we see down here in verse 4, yet you still have a few persons who have not soiled their clothes. So there's a call to basically to give up those who are dead at this point, but work on those who remain. And obviously the question throughout all these in terms of waking up is being reminded of the resistance to the Roman imperial context that is the consistent message throughout. So what has remained is on the point of death, so it's not quite, but still could be recovered. For I have not found, and the phrase for not found here is eureka, as in the motto of the state of California, Eureka. But important here is that it's a juridical term. It's like a finding of not guilty or guilty. So being found, not found here, eureka, is as if there's a judgment being made. Not found that your works were, and the word translated here perfect is better translated fulfilled. So they've started, but they're dying. And what they've been assigned to do by the risen Christ, which is to embody a community of resistance, is not reached its completion. Not been fulfilled. And as Auni notes, it's probably meant ironically that this I have not found your conduct perfect. In light of that you're dead, it's like not nearly perfect, basically the opposite of perfect. So in light of that indictment, here's the admonition. So to remember, and it's used once here, and we'll see it in the Babylon fall scene in chapter 18, what you have received and heard, obey it and repent. Or literally keep it, terio, the common verb in the Septuagint and the New Testament for keeping commandments. And you see it's used quite a number of times here in Revelation. So here comes the threat. If you don't wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. The come like a thief here, as noted as we started here, is probably a reference to how the Persians and Greeks came to Sardis and attacked them by surprise. So as so often, John's imagery echoes cultural traditions and Hebrew scripture references that the audience would know. And you will not know at what hour I will come to you. An hour used quite a number of times here in Revelation to express the suddenness and the moment of decision that has to take place. And so here's the remaining option here, the thread of hope. And it plays in this clothing theme, as we noted at the beginning. The landscape there was very fitting for sheep rearing, and so the wool industry and the carpet industry were famous throughout the region. And so, as we'll see in Laodicea in the 7th message, the economy is being skewered here in ironic contrast. So you still have a few, and the word for few, holiga, here is a similar word to loipoi that we saw earlier for the faithful remnant. So the handful of persons who have not soiled their clothes. And the word for soiled here, amalunan, means to be ritually defiled. You can see it here in 14:4. Those who have not defiled themselves with women, which, as we'll see, is not about literal sex, but about intercourse with empire, as all the sexual language in Revelation is. So have not soiled their clothes, the hamatia here, which is to say not their ketonis, the robe, but the clothes that you wouldn't see. So the underlayer. And they will walk with me, a Genesis echo here, to walk with God. And used finally at the very end in Revelation 21:24, the nations will walk by the light of New Jerusalem. So those who have not soiled their clothes, who are still awake, mixing metaphors there, will walk with me dressed in white. And this is the first time we're seeing about white clothes, but look how many times it's going to come up in Revelation. Those around the throne who are wearing white, and we'll see a number of images of white clothes. It can refer to heavenly messengers like angels, or to priestly garments, to worshipers participating in sacrifices, or, as my note there says, by the first century, the dead were buried in white in Judaism. So it could be quite a number of options for what the dress in white signifies. And the description for why, because they were worthy here, axios, is used a number of times, as we see. Only here is it attributed to anybody other than God or Christ. So although Sardis is conceived dead, the message comes around to people who are raised up as being worthy for hanging in there in spite of the majority of the community having given in to the imperial blandishments. So finally we come around here, if you conquer. And we have the note from Gibbon there, the assurance of the victor includes both the interim heavenly state of the blessed, as in white garments, and its guaranteed sequel, the favorable final or general judgment in which the victor's name will be found in the book of life. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. So, if you conquer, so note the conditional there, if you conquer, you will be clothed like them in white robes. So, in addition to those who are to be clothed in white robes because they have not soiled their clothes, to the others, if they participate, they will share in wearing those white robes. And I will not blot your name out of the book of life. And some technical things to look at here. The word for not here is a double negative, umi, so it's really strong. The word for blot is a technical term, ekklesiai, which means literally, as you can see from Auni and Athens, whenever any citizen was sentenced to be executed for a crime, his name was first erased from the roll of citizens. Thus a technical term for erasing the names of citizens from the registry, which fits the context that the book of life has origins in a citizen list in the Near Eastern ancient royal world, where the king would have a list of the people who were approved of, or people who had been come through a justice trial of some kind and they had their names cleared. So the biblical use of Book of Life, as you can see there from Daniel and other places, is borrowed from other imperial contexts where the king would decide who was approved, and of course here the issue is God gets to decide who's approved. And so, if you conquer, I will not blot your name. And the name is what we saw in verse 3:1. So the name of the community here. Blot the name of the church in Sardis out of God's book of life. And we're going to see it's a number of times also in Revelation later. So we'll see that in New Jerusalem all the way to the end, where the book of life is key to those who have made it into New Jerusalem. And not only will the name not be blotted out, the negative, so their name will still be in the book of life. The risen Christ will confess your name before my Father and before his angels. This is the only use of the verb for confess here, homologiso, and it's used in the apocalyptic discourse in the synoptic gospels, like in this little passage in Mark about confessing. And it's the only place here, though, where the risen Christ says that he will literally stand up for one of these ekklesia before God and before the angels. And it concludes, of course, with the common refrain, let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying in the churches. So that's a brief overview of the message of the church in Sardis, and we'll see next time it's really connected with the church in Philadelphia in some ways, and we'll look at scholarship that shows how these two are connected as we wind our way to the end for the church in Laodicea. Okay, see you next time. Bye-bye.